Hi everyone, can you hear me? Hi everyone. Good morning everyone, and welcome to this panel, Waste Outlooks, where we're going to hear from key industry participants regarding infrastructure and investment. I'm Katherine Driscoll from Impact. This is a topic that cuts across almost everybody really in the waste industry. Without infrastructure, there are no waste management services. With too little infrastructure or restrained capacity, the access to and cost of waste services can be uncertain. Establishing infrastructure is not a task for the faint-hearted. The planning pathway, the investor requirements and the promise of tonnes, they are all multifaceted challenges which are front and centre of decision-making. Clear regulatory settings are essential to support infrastructure development. We all know that, and we all know what the challenges are for waste infrastructure across all of the jurisdictions. So this morning we have a panel with an enormous depth of experience and ongoing roles in exactly this topic. We're going to hear from the panel, their views, their outlook, and the particular components that they have in their view while they are tasked with thinking about waste management infrastructure. So I won't repeat all of their bio information, but I'll quickly introduce the panel. First up we have Geoff Webster. Geoff's the President of the Waste Management and Resource Recovery Association of Australia, and also Geoff is the Director of an engineering consultancy, Waste and Management Services. In addition to this, he has a number of other director roles, both within and without and outside the waste industry. Phil Carbons is the General Manager of Business Development for Veolia, Australia and New Zealand. Phil has 25 years engineering, operations, asset and business management experience within technical, environmental and regulated industries, including over 20 years waste management and resource recovery experience. And the rose between the thorns, Susie McBurney from Remondis. Susie is the General Manager for New South Wales and ACT for Remondis, and Susie is responsible for 16 operational sites, including resource recovery facilities, transfer stations and landfill operations, as well as municipal, commercial and industrial collection operations. With extensive experience in managing complex operations and large teams, Susie has driven industry and organisational change as the champion, first female operational state manager for Cleanaway, and then the first female state general manager at Remondis, and also took out the prestigious 2021 Women of Waste Award. Richie Farrell from Cleanaway. Richie was appointed Head of Investor Relations at Cleanaway in April 2020. His responsibilities include establishing and expanding relationships with investment analysts, industry analysts and investors worldwide. He provides input on financial and sustainable reporting activities and manages engagement with various stakeholders. And another interesting addition to this panel is Chris McLean from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Chris is the lead partner of PwC's Energy Transition Team and advises stakeholders across the waste management hierarchy and circular economy supply chain. Chris's team's work within the waste and recycling sector focuses on M&A transactions, capital raising and co-development of infrastructure investments. And I'm certain that Chris is going to bring a viewpoint that we all need to be more mindful of in this space. So how we're going to run this panel is each panel member is going to give a brief overview of their outlook for investment and infrastructure, and then we'll have some panel, a bit more open discussion. So I will hand over to Geoff first, but please welcome our panel this morning.
So thank you very much, everyone, for having me. I'd like to note I'm a very shy, quiet and retiring type of person. You'll note I've taken off the tie as well, so this is me relaxing. And what it means is basically feel free to hit us up as hard as you like with any of the questions that you might have through the day, because that's what we're here for today. And we get the most out of this by you guys nailing us as much as you can while we're up here. Thank you for that. So look, I've been asked to then just talk about a bit of a higher level sort of approach and some of the key things from a WAMA perspective that are key issues within the industry. And so look, for me, I think there are a couple of really key ones. One is procurement. The sustainable procurement, the procurement by government to come through, look at those markets, try and support the market development, etc. Looking at those export bans, what are the issues that are going to arise from the export bans when they kick in? Looking at the quality of products, etc., that are out there. What is then going to be staying within the country? Take paper and fibre, for example. And I know we've got Visi here today. There's been a lot of money in this space, but you can see with a potential glut of fibre that's going to occur if we don't sort out that marketplace in the next little while, then the value of fibre will drop significantly and it'll potentially threaten every single curbside recycling program that's in the country. So this is a really key issue that I feel needs to be resolved. There is then the strategic looking at waste infrastructure, looking at how infrastructure is established around the country. We know, again, we're looking at plastics. There's a classic example there. We've got some really great infrastructure that certain groups do. Again, Visi's done some really good work in this place. There's more product processing capabilities that's coming online, but there's a gap. So there are real problems with plastics at the moment because we don't have the producing or production capability to deal with some of these products. Red Cycle, great initiative, all those things that it could do, but nowhere for the materials to go. And unless we can sort out some of those really key fundamentals and get the support from government, support from industry and everyone working together in those sorts of spaces, then it makes life really hard, and it means that we can't really address the issues that are facing us at the moment. So I'm just keeping it short and sweet at this point in time. I just wanted to do a couple of minutes at the very start to talk about that. But those are some of the key issues that I see at that broader pitch and that higher level facing the industry at the moment. Thank you. We'll go across to Phil.
Thanks, Jeffrey. There are 537 councils in Australia, 128 of those in New South Wales, 33 in Greater Sydney. The largest of those being Blacktown with over 400,000 people. By comparison, Brisbane City Council has 1.2 million people. Just imagine what you could do if you could guarantee the feedstock to a service provider to provide the infrastructure based on guaranteed feedstock for your FOGO bin, your recycling bin, or your red residual bin over a long period. This is one of the pillars of success of a project. For a project to be delivered, you need the policy and regulation settings that are so fundamental to anything that we do. It's kind of the why. Why are we going to do this? Because it's actually the reason we want to do it. You also need the land. You've got to be able to do it somewhere. Land's a pretty interesting topic, but you also need a consent. And as we know, consent can take a while for those that are involved, can take years or decades, depending on the size and scale of your project. And that's the sort of challenges that we attempt to deal with and address. The other pillars are the feedstock that I mentioned, and Council have the real opportunity to guarantee the size, the volume, the scale and term that will underpin a successful project. Then you need the offtake. Well, a couple of classic examples, and I hear there's lots of conversations going around FOGO. There's what goes in and there's what goes out. But don't forget that FOGO processing is a manufacturing process for a compost product that's going to be applied to land. That's the objective. It's not a waste diversion objective. It's actually a reuse objective. It's a manufacturing objective. It's not a let's get everything out of our red bin and put it in the green bin and hope that we can reduce our landfill or increase our landfill diversion. Then we also need a social licence, and this is a topic that is pretty intense. And social licence can be considered to be solving everybody's NIMBY issue. The reality is that we are in the essential service business. The same as power generation, the same as a hospital, same as a wastewater treatment plant. And you know what? People don't like those in their backyard either. But the reality is, as a society, we need essential waste management infrastructure. It's fundamental to the health and success of a society. And so we need to take a different view of what social licence means. It doesn't solve everybody's problem. We're never going to do that. But we need everybody, every level of government, industry, community, to acknowledge what we need to deliver successful projects. What I haven't talked about yet is a technical solution. And the reason for that is because there are a whole bunch of really smart people that can provide a technical solution. It's a fundamental part and it's a fundamental pillar of a successful project, but it's not necessarily the starting point in my view. Once we've got all those pillars sorted out, then we come to the finance bit. But if you've got every other box ticked, the finance bit gets ticked pretty easily as well. Then we have to build it. I'm not sure if anybody's tried to build anything in the last couple of years. House reno, just doubled in price, or any other infrastructure that you're trying to build, finding the people, the resources and the cost impacts that are happening there. So building is achievable, but also a challenge in that space. And then finally you get to commission it, and then you get to operate it. Well, at your operational phase is probably a number of years after you started the project. And you really hope that those policy and regulation settings that were in place 5 or 10 years previous still apply. And we know that policy and regulation changes a lot throughout the time. They are the pillars of a successful project. How do we deliver it? Collaboratively and working together and bringing the solutions that we have and the passion in the room to fundamentally change and deliver the successful waste infrastructure management that we require for our growing society. Thank you.
It is always tough following Phil Carbons. Thank you, Katherine, for your warm introduction. The challenges around investment and infrastructure in the waste management industry aren't new and are certainly familiar to Remondis. Remondis is a family-run company that operates in 30 countries with an annual turnover of 21 billion Australian dollars, 47,000 employees, and we service over 200,000 industrial and commercial clients. We operate over 1,000 plants worldwide, including 16 energy from waste, 7 plastics processing, 23 anaerobic digesters, and a staggering 52 FOGO composting facilities. I wanted to talk about the targets the New South Wales Government have set. They want to halve food waste, and for those that attended Joe's presentation, we are certainly a long way away from that. We want an average resource recovery rate of 80%, and we want to triple the plastics recycling rate. These are certainly ambitious in the Australian context, however completely achievable worldwide. How has this been achieved? Now, what I'm going to say might be slightly controversial. They have banned landfill. We talk about how do you divert something from landfill. The quickest way to do that is for that not to be an option. It's the quickest way to facilitate change. Germany banned landfill in 2005. Increasing a local levy will get you there. However, let's be honest, it's much slower. It relies upon landfill becoming more expensive than recycling. Banning landfill gives certainty to industry to invest in the relevant infrastructure and investment required for processing and recycling. Banning landfill, though, requires an alternative, and that alternative is energy from waste. Energy from waste is widely used in Europe and has a superior environmental outcome compared to landfill. This is certainly challenging, as Phil alluded to, in the New South Wales context, and we need social licence. And we certainly need to look at the 4 precincts model if we're going to move forward in that direction. In addition, and we heard yesterday, the targets are achieved in Europe with a better CDS system. Since the introduction of CDS in New South Wales, we've recycled 9.3 billion bottles with a 10-cent deposit, with an average recovery rate of 65%. In Europe, the deposit is more than 40 cents Australian, and they have an overall recovery rate of 91%, with Germany having 98%. An increase to the container deposit value and expansion of eligible containers needs to be considered in order to step change our resource recovery rate. The recent announcement in Queensland to accept wine bottles is a great move in this direction. With all this recycling, the material needs to go somewhere and have a viable offtake, something we are all too familiar with the recent Red Cycle example. Europe has onshore processing facilities within the EU for recovered material, which is recycled back into raw materials for the circular economy. This is similar for organics. Germany has required segregation at source of organics since 2015, which is used as a feedstock for anaerobic digesters and composting facilities. The anaerobic digestion market is supported by opportunities for 20-year fixed energy offtakes, price guarantee, with relatively high energy pricing. Remondis operates 78 public-private partnerships with councils worldwide, covering 33 million inhabitants, providing services for energy from waste, composting, anaerobic digesters, paper and cardboard, municipal collections, the list goes on. This model facilitates certainty and risk sharing around feedstock, infrastructure, investment, offtake and term, all of the things contractors need in order to provide the best services for council. It sounds simple, doesn't it? In order to achieve this in the New South Wales context, the following things need to be addressed: banning landfill, revisiting the New South Wales energy from waste precincts, segregation at source of organics, reviewing the CDS deposit value, planning and consent pathways and timeframes. When councils go out to tender, to Phil's point, it may take us 5 or 10 years to build your facility. And if you want a competitive process, you need to allow that time for industry. Reinvestment of the waste levy. I mean, it's a touchy topic, but we've got $780 million there that the government could certainly assist us with the infrastructure. Regulatory certainty. To Phil's point again, we need to make sure it's still the same thing in 5 or 10 years' time. There's many councils, I'm sure, in the room that have built facilities or signed up with contracts that then they found themselves change throughout that time. And government has a huge role here in creating the demand for offtakes too. So it was refreshing to hear Tony talk about that this morning in terms of that procurement policy. If we are serious about meeting the New South Wales targets, and I really hope we are, this will require political courage and conviction now. Otherwise, we'll still be talking about this in another 20 years.
I think that's even harder to follow now. So I've only been in the waste industry for about 3 years, so I don't profess to know as much as my esteemed colleagues here, but I've come from an energy background and electricity background, and there's lots of parallels to be drawn from that industry and the waste industry. So they're both very complex. When you start to scratch at the surface, you end up going down different rabbit holes in terms of trying to achieve different outcomes. So I think it's really important to try and frame the problem that we're trying to address. And some of the things, if you compare and contrast to the energy sector, you know, when we wanted to put a decarbonisation plan or a renewable energy plan in place, you set mandated targets. You go, I want to get from here to here, and how do I do that? I put in a mandatory scheme to achieve that. Similar to some of the targets that Susie was talking about. If you actually put the policies and the regulations and the legislation in place and make it a society-wide problem and a society-wide opportunity, you can then gradually get to the point that you want to get to. So whether it's landfill diversion, increase in recycling rates, whatever that might be, you go, this is where I am, this is where I want to get to, here's the scheme. We all share in achieving that scheme. It doesn't matter if my waste has been FOGO'd or your waste has been FOGO'd. As long as we all eventually get there over time, that's what's important for society. And then it removes some of the problems around, you know, trying to contract with a Brisbane City Council versus a smaller Blacktown Council. So you want to align when you're building new infrastructure. You want to have the developers of that infrastructure aligned with the users of that infrastructure and ensure that both the off-taker and the developer have and share the same risks in terms of that. And that's what reduces sort of the investment costs in these types of assets that are required. There's a huge opportunity across the waste industry at the moment with the transition of the industry. You've got the likes of energy from waste, the FOGO opportunities, plastic recycling. I think I read flicked through Joe's report on the plane on the way up, and I think we were at 13% recovery of plastics. So there's like a massive opportunity obviously there. And again, through all of the different waste streams, massive opportunities. I think we should think about this more positively. Think about how can we influence the legislators, the politicians, to put in place schemes and investment predictability and certainty to allow us to get to the goal that we want to achieve. Thank you.
Thanks, Rishi. Last on this is not the best position to be in, but anyway, let's go. I think we've been just all talking about there's a disconnect between the people that set the targets and the actual people responsible for doing them. So the people that set them, federal and state governments, the people that actually do it are the councils and the private sector. So when you're responsible for doing something, but it's not your target, then that's a bit different. So we've all spoken about that. And my job really is to bring private sector money into this space. And this is a really attractive space. So globally, about $30 billion went into this space in the last 12 months, but only 15% in the Asia-Pac region. And most recently, there's a transaction over in the UK with the Energy Capital Partners buying Biffa for about $4 billion. The transaction multiples over there are about 10 times to 12 times, even higher than that. What that means is when they invest, they've got a lot of certainty around what's going to happen in 10 or 12 years. So they think they get their money back over 10 or 12 years. I don't think there's many transactions down here that you can say that to. And that's because we don't have certainty for that length of time. Tony Chappell today spoke about he's going to look at data, infrastructure and markets. And very welcome that he's going to look at those spaces, particularly from an investor lens. And I just think when we do that, we need to own one thing. This is going to be inflationary. You can't build new stuff to replace old stuff or stuff that doesn't exist without driving up cost. So we need to own that, and then we need to put policies in place that mitigate the cost of living for people now. So how can the government do that? And their responsibility here is to set a framework that brings the lowest cost of capital. So who wants the lowest return for the longest period of time into this space? So pension funds, superannuation funds, infrastructure funds. They don't want their money back at the moment, right? They're getting your money every week, 12% of it. They can't deploy it fast enough, right? They don't want money coming back to them. That gives them another problem to deploy. So if we want that money to come in that doesn't want to return very quickly and is the lowest cost to consumers, how do we do it? So there's an electricity infrastructure roadmap, got released a couple of years ago, that's driving the real, because electricity is in exactly the same spot here. We have to replace a whole bunch of kit really quickly to hit a target. There is a target there, so that's what we spoke about. We don't have a target properly yet that's enforceable. Notwithstanding that, the state government had to take ownership of that because the feds did nothing. And just while we're on the feds, last night, the federal budget, circular economy, got nothing, not a cent. So we're up against it again from the federal level. States have got a chance here, and Tony Chappell is, as I said before, making the right noises. So in the electricity infrastructure roadmap, what the state government does there is they underwrite supply agreements for a long period of time, 20 years, long period of time, guarantee an outcome for investors. So you could do that. We've got a market here on the other side of it. We talked about fibre. If the fibre market collapses, it has a flow-on impact back. Can we look at underwriting the cost of the price of fibre markets to just get some stability for the long term? That will also, apart from bringing in the private sector equity, that brings banks back to the table because at the moment they're not there. And just on government procurement, or just an example, so governments know that they're going to build infrastructure for the next 10, 15 years. That's a certain fact. However, they have rolling contracts for 2 or 3 years that you get if you're, for example, disposing of C&D waste from a tunnel. How can governments do a bit more than that rather than guarantee just for one contractor 2 or 3 years, just underwrite it for 10? It'll lower the cost of the infrastructure return and drive down costs for consumers. I think that's all I've got for now. So I think I don't really want any drilling questions or what was... Was that the word, Jeffrey, or nailed? I don't want any of that, but some soft, questions up here for me. The rest of them, go for it.
Okay, some really great insights there and some great comments, so thank you to the panel. We're going to open up the floor to some questions in a minute, but there are some sort of emerging questions, I think, that we can have the panel discuss. Yeah, you've got the microphones. I think they're activated once somebody needs to start talking, so let's see how we go. My first question to the panel is, the Waste Management Association of Australia, just before the New South Wales election, issued a 7-point plan. So for the panel members, if you were Premier, what would you hope to be your top 3 first-term achievements?
Well, seeing as I'm the President, I might answer that one. I think for me, and I touched on them before, the procurement side. For example, if I look at some of the roadways that are being developed at the moment, and you look at sound attenuation walls, I could take up almost all the plastics in the country in lining those roadways with the attenuation walls. Simple procurement methods like that would actually deal with a lot of our issues very, very quickly. Problem is, of course, it's more expensive than some of the alternatives. And so where is that political will, where is that financial will to be able to drive some of those things along? I think that's a really critical one. I think the strategic infrastructure that you have here, you saw the example last year with the floods, some of the impacts on the Sydney marketplace and on everybody, every resident, etc. They stopped collecting in a lot of instances because they had nowhere for the material to go. They couldn't get there, the roads were flooded, the rail went down. It was really bad. Again, I think in some respects it actually works in our favour as an industry because, again, it just reinforces the essential nature of what we do. And so I think some of those areas are really important for the government to be looking at. I'll hand over to someone else. Just a couple. Does someone else want to make a comment, Phil?
I'd concur with the infrastructure plan. There's talk of one, and Tony mentioned it today as well, that it's coming. It's been coming for a while. It's been on the list of things to do. I think also that there's a lot of information and data that's collected and collated by the EPA, and I understand the sensitive nature of that, but I think there needs to be a greater collaboration with industry to actually engage and understand what their plans might be to deliver that future infrastructure. But that's the key message. It is that infrastructure plan, where it's going to be, and policy. We've talked about it, I talked about it, everyone's talked about it. We need to know and understand, and particularly for the likes of Chris and saying long-term planning and investment requires long-term policy. We as an industry, whether it's be council and state government and federal governments, we've got a lot of KPIs, we've got a lot of objectives, but there's no consequences if we don't meet those objectives. We just go and rewrite the strategy. And how often has this happened? And for some of the elder statesmen in the room, it's been Mr. Wainberg laughing. It's been an ongoing topic that keeps reappearing, but there are no consequences. And that's where there's been significant change in other parts of the world is there's been some thou shalt, and if you don't, this is the consequence of not achieving it. And that's not here. Do we have the political will to do that in Australia? We're not very good at that as Australians. That's not the type of approach we like. But I think we need to take a fundamental step change to achieve something.
Look, it's going to come as no surprise if I was Premier for a day, and coming on from what Phil was talking about, I would ban landfill. If we don't burn that bridge at some point, we are never going to be able to move away from it. Now, look, I'm not saying you do that overnight, but you need to set a date and a target to allow industry, council, government to work to it, to put the relevant infrastructure in place with the certainty that you're not going to have that facility essentially not be viable because there's still a landfill option. So I would ban landfill, put a mandated date about when that had to stop, whether that's 10 years, 15 years from now. But if we don't actually set that, how are we actually ever going to move truly to something that is a 80 or 100% diversion from landfill. I guess second to that would be revisiting the 4 precincts model for energy from waste. I think we have to be, we don't have the social licence yet, and to be honest, I think industry really has a role there in education. I mean, it's certain what it looks like worldwide, but how do we get the Australian public on board? How do we get the New South Wales public on board with that? And I really think, like I said, government and industry really has a role to play in that. Last but not least would be planning and approval timeframes. I mean, every person on this panel has a story to tell about how long their facility took to get approved, how much money it cost, what conditions they were given they weren't expecting. And then, like you say, and you're trying to work in what can be some long-term contracts. And we need those long-term contracts, whether it be 18 years, 25 years. And there's certainly some challenges when you are working through such a time frame because things can change. I mean, I don't want to mention M word, but I'm going to. And we've got to be in a position that we can move with that.
Thanks. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the banning of landfills, but I certainly agree with the 4 precinct issue with respect to energy from waste. That's just a silly policy, really. I mean, how can you say that, one power station in Lithgow is different to another power station in Lithgow, for example? Are the climatic conditions different that give rise to a different, health outcome? I think there needs to be a more science-based approach to this type of planning. Again, coming from an electricity background, I had the same issues with wind farms where, there was like 17 Senate inquiries into, the health effects of wind farms, which were all, basically debunked. So in relation to that, yeah, certainly energy from waste needs to be revisited. And then I think where I disagree on the landfill side is more about having that transition plan, so having mandated targets to achieve whatever outcome you want. And that would naturally cause a move away from landfill into alternative solutions.
I might just throw in a bit extra, that's right, because again, as the association, we don't believe in the banning of the landfills either. Landfills play a critical part, an essential part in what we do. But in South Australia, again, we have banned materials going to landfill. So the bans can work. We do use it in some jurisdictions. And so, I think it's about balance. Everything that I talk about is always about balance. I say it to my kids, it's all about balance what you do. Homework versus playing on the computer games, same sort of thing. The other key thing actually that I wanted to touch on was the procurement side. I feel that a lot of councils are actually hamstrung by the procurement policies that are in place within the government and the inability to actually negotiate through tender processes to then enable best outcome for the councils. I find that a really restrictive practice. And I know it's there, it's the Act, you have to do those sorts of things, probaty's there, all that sort of stuff. But it hurts. You want some really good deals go by because you can't actually negotiate with people. And I think that'd be a major change I'll be looking at as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask the entire panel a question about that in a minute. So thank you for introducing that topic. I want to just dig a little bit deeper into infrastructure planning. Most of the jurisdictions have long-term strategies and accompanying infrastructure plans. So what do you see as being essential in that infrastructure planning? How, when the state jurisdictions set targets, the infrastructure plans should really align with those and tell us how we're going to get to those targets. So what do you see as crucial components of infrastructure plans?
I think New South Wales has the Waste and Sustainable Materials Strategy, and it was a high-level document. We had a delivery plan that was released in December 2021, and in that plan, there was, at the back, there was a table, and there was going to be a lot of things happened in 2022. And in my view, the majority have not happened. And I don't know the number. There was probably 20 activities or actions that were required in that space. So there might be reason to revisit that plan. I think the infrastructure strategy will help refine that. But let's just do what we said we were going to do in the first place, rather than spending the time rethinking. There was enough action and activity in there that would move us forward. There was conversations earlier this morning about moving in a stepwise fashion, in a gradual fashion rather than a stepwise fashion. Let's implement some of those and take action on the things that we've already discussed, rather than trying to revisit. I'm sure there's other approaches to that, but lots of work's been done. Let's build on that.
Yeah, Phil, and I think, look, it was, again, refreshing for Tony today to say they are revisiting those infrastructure plans with more data. But data's one thing, but what industry need to invest in that infrastructure is feedstock volume. So I think there's a missing piece there around, for this infrastructure to be built, it requires council volumes, it requires joint procurement, it requires term, it requires certainty. So I think there's a fundamental disconnect between we need this infrastructure, but again, this isn't, build it and they will come. As a contractor, we need that certainty. So I think there's a disconnect between the infrastructure we require and how we get that commercial close, to Chris's point, like what councils, what volume, what term, what pricing mechanisms.
Yeah, I think just from an investor, they need to consult from an investor perspective and from a consumer perspective and be honest about it. It's going to cost more. So we've got to put policies in place to alleviate the cost of living pressures. Don't put that back on the councils and make them deal with it through rates, because it's just not going to work. Like, it won't work. So they've just got to own it.
And I think if it is going to cost more, we want to minimise what that cost more is going to be. So you need to have, back to Susie's point, certainty on, if you're going to build infrastructure, you need to have certainty on the feedstock side of things. You want to have a long-term agreement. So I think to Bill's point, or no, Chris's point on infrastructure funds, super funds, there's lots of money out there to invest into these types of assets, but they want to have long-term certainty on those on that infrastructure, and that's where you get the lower cost of capital and therefore lower costs, even though it'll be somewhat inflationary.
Okay, thank you. Well, we do hear a lot about cost of living pressures. It seems to be the new flagship for a lot of commentary around the country at the moment, cost of living pressures. We also hear that the levies are really the main tool to drive the appropriate infrastructure. We've had the levy in New South Wales for around 2 decades, and the case for numerous local councils is that their communities are paying more for lower levels of resource recovery. So, are there quick fixes? Waste services, the costs are increasing all the time. The current settings seem to be contributing to that. So, does the panel have any quick fixes on how we can address the cost of living pressures? Because it all feeds down to the household cost of living.
I think I'll just quickly jump in. So you need to do things at scale. So procurement at scale, like that drives the economic cost of this down. So you want to have, when it is inflationary, because it will be, you need to drive the cost down as much as you can. So you need to procure at scale. We've spoken about all the things that will attract the cheapest cost of capital to it. So it's not the only overnight fix, and you saw it in energy today and in the budget last night. I'm sorry, but you just have to subsidise it, direct payments to consumers for a period of time, because we're going through a transition. It's no different. We're going through a transition here. There has to be direct payments to consumers, and be honest about it, because that's what's going to have to happen.
I agree with a lot of that. I think also there's reinvestment. We talk about the levy fund, etc. There's a lot of money sitting there. You know, again, when you're looking at companies who are investing, you look at councils who are investing, they have to then get a return on the capital. And so if the government can step in with some of the money that's sitting there, some of those funds, then that will again assist in offsetting some of the initial capital spend, and then will mean you won't need as high a return in the background. So I think that makes a big difference. I think that maybe there are other things as well, and I've got no idea about this one, but maybe reward systems. Are there ways that you can actually give benefit back somehow to people that are doing a good job? I don't know. There might be other options that are out there as well, but some of that thinking needs to apply if we're trying to do a quick fix, so to speak.
You can always make the claim that all levies should go back to the resource recovery sector, so we'll start with that as a principle. But I think another approach is around the grant arrangements that exist in most states, including New South Wales, and A question in my mind, and I know the EPA reports on this, but how they're getting bang for their buck. It seems to be spread quite broadly, and if we are talking about significant scale infrastructure to solve large volume problems, and we're saying large procurement is one, the scale of it, of guaranteeing the feedstock, but is therefore a need to, in particular, say in the energy sector, where there's the funding is larger percentage of those capital costs, noting that the O&M or operation maintenance costs over a 20-year term are probably 7 or 8 times or 10 times more than the capital cost. So it's not just the capital cost that ensures success of a project, but if that can be reduced, then that's one aspect of the financial model that's lowered the impact. So a consideration would be allocating the grant funding to specific solutions and outcomes rather than perhaps what I would consider a bit more broad and random approach that exists today.
And look, I certainly agree with everything the panel members have said. I think the one thing I would bring up would be risk allocation. Essentially, I appreciate it, councils are risk adverse, but essentially that risk isn't free. So essentially your contractor then just embeds that into their contract, whether that be contamination, change of law, all of these things. So I think we really have to move along the maturity path there about having far more transparent contracts, like genuine risk sharing, where we go, look, especially if we're in a 18-year term or a 25-year term, which is what you need if you're building a energy from waste or a new FOGO site. I think there's a real conversation about risk allocation, because essentially if you're coming to me at the beginning of your contract wanting me to accept 20% contamination in your FOGO bin, now even if that's 5, I've had to build that facility for the worst possible scenario that you're putting into my contract. So I think, I really think there's a conversation there about risk allocation. We talk about how to lower costs. Yes, that would lower costs because essentially the industry wouldn't have to allow for that in their contract price. But on the flip side, that really is where council want to sit on that risk profile.
Mostly covered.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think, Phil, you just introduced an interesting part of this discussion, which is the large volume solutions. There seems to be a diluting of focus, which sometimes is not helpful. Is that a problem in that there's solutions for low volume solutions where we really need a concentration of providing solutions, even if it was, sorry Susie, increased landfill capacity in Sydney. If that was the issue, it seems like focusing on smaller volumes is not solving the big volume issues. What do you say about that?
I'll kick off. I think it's about defining the problem. What's the problem you're trying to solve for? And then you go from there and you go, what are the biggest parts of that problem? And then work your way down. I mean, just to your point, if you just pick, everyone can have a little niche thing that they've an interest in and they might want to achieve something out of that. But if there's a broader societal problem that we need to deal with, we need to understand what that is and then put the policies and the regulation in place to actually address that. So whether it be landfill, energy from waste, FOGO, define what you want to achieve. If you were to start it all over again and go, okay, we woke up in the morning and we've got this issue with waste and nothing existed, what would we do? Look at it from that perspective and then design a scheme that looks like that.
I think from a geography perspective, there's different markets. There's Sydney and there's the rest of New South Wales, and that they do have to be managed, treated, and different solutions may apply to that scale issue. But Sydney's very large, 5 million, growing to 6 million people. There's not a lot of space to do things there, and that city, a global city, is going to be reliant on the solutions and services that are going to be occurring outside that city. That brings into an issue around transport, which is obviously rail's a logical conclusion rather than road. But it's a combination of, again, back to an essential service, that city needs to operate. Can't see any landfills popping up in Wallara. But, you know, it needs to happen somewhere, and collectively need to solve it. The scale of it is still going to be a challenge that we need to resolve, but I think there is a geographical separation.
Yeah, just to build on that, you know, one of the things that we look at as an industry is best practice. But what does best practice actually mean? Because it actually changes when you move to different areas, and it's something, a solution has to be tailored to suit the environment within which you operate, and that environment is the government, the economic, the environmental, you know, and so you actually have to look at that. Far western New South Wales will come up with a very different solution to what is developed in Metro Sydney. And so that's a really important factor, I feel, that needs to be considered in every solution that you look at for each of the different streams that you're playing with. You know, down in Tassie, you might be doing something very different to up here in New South Wales. It always will change. And so there needs to be the flexibility in both the regulatory space as well as a financial space within a company to say how we're going to provide a solution to the problem in this instance.
I think you're right, Katherine. I think sometimes we need to major on the majors, and I think we're all talking here about whether that be increasing disposal capacity in Sydney. But I think we can all are familiar with sometimes there's a high-profile, tiny waste that gets a lot of attention, a lot of grant funding, as opposed to us majoring on the majors. So we're saying that if we're going to get to our New South Wales targets, we need to be diverting from landfill. Yeah, so I absolutely agree we need landfill capacity, but diversion from landfill by its very definition says divert from landfill, do not take it there. So I think we need to be focusing on our FOGO capacity, we need to be focusing on those things we can do about that resource recovery to 80%. And like I said, there are some of those high profile waste streams which are small, and I think sometimes they get more of the attention than they should.
Just add a quick note there, diversion from landfill, and if we're talking about soft plastics, they don't weigh a lot. I know, but I'm just being clear that so maybe our target, our KPI, it needs to be a different KPI or an additional KPI. Diversion from landfill has been around for a while, but do we need to change those KPIs to say what is another measure of success to achieve our objectives? So yes, I think it needs to evolve.
Okay, I'm going to swing back now to local council waste management. It's a big part of the system, and there's the audience is full of local council people here. And when local councils are procuring waste services, we are very constrained by the regulatory framework. I think you've said it, Geoff, that you want to see contracts negotiated when you're in a tender phase. I mean, that would be ideal, I think, rather than having to go through the process of rejecting all tenders and then starting a negotiation process. We've all followed a few of those in recent years, and it's really challenging for local councils to have to stick to the framework. So I think we've identified some of the problems. How can we overcome these problems to further support infrastructure investment? Do we have to rewrite the reg?
Yes.
Okay.
So had the opportunity back in 2016 in this very forum to present, and the conclusion out of that was the alliance model. And coming from Suez at the time and Veolia today, where we have much of our businesses revolved around the water business, and they are very much aligned or have alliance model solutions that they deliver beneficial outcomes to both parties because they're an acknowledgement of the risk sharing that's available to achieve those objectives over the long term. Things change, everyone's in, everybody's got the upside and everybody's got the downside. And both parties, particularly the operator, works very hard at minimising the costs of operation, and those benefits flow through to the other party. So, and that works because Hunter Water, Sydney Water, the various water authorities have different rules to play with than local government. So I would support that. I don't think it's a short-term outcome, unfortunately.
No.
I'm 100% behind everything that Phil just said, basically. I mean, I touched on that before. I'm involved in a number of different tendering processes and negotiations, and it sucks, quite simply. You know, you have to cancel what, you can see the solution. You can see how you can move your way forward, and you can't actually do it because the rules prevent you from doing it. Probity steps in, too bad you can't do it. So I think there is a change. Do I know what the changing the wording of the regs needs to be? No, I don't. You know, there's some very smart lawyers and other people that'd be able to sort their way through that, but it's a principle. And I think that, you know, as an industry, as leaders from within councils, etc., that's the goal, you know, to be able to go and say, this is a principle that we want to try and work within. How do we do that? And then how do you work to actually deliver it? And again, I mean, there are opportunities even now to be able to try and do it. I'm working on contracts where we're trying to get that win-win approach where you do the risk sharing. And I'm glad that it was raised before, because I think that that the risk element is really important. And if you can take the risk away from business, they say thank you very much. If they can guarantee that they're going to get a return, that, you know, someone's going to work with them, and Phil touched on it, on the risk reward, you set up structures that mean that if they do better, they can earn more. Brilliant, they're really happy. If they get their guaranteed base and they make more as they go through, if they perform and do a great job, everyone wins. And I think that win-win approach is something that really needs to try and come through. It's not combative, it's not an us and them. If you get into that phase, it just gets really messy, really hard. And then what you do is you spend a lot of time negotiating and arguing, and it's the one thing that none of us have, time. And, you know, it's probably the most valuable asset that we all have. And you want them using it on other things rather than arguing with someone about why they've gone and had to spend extra maintenance on a conveyor or extra labour coming in to do some work. It doesn't work.
I think state governments have got a big role to play here as a facilitator, not necessarily in the room facilitator, but in terms of giving transparency around what's happened in the local council next to you or other local councils together. So if you can't do a joint procurement model for whatever reason, and, you know, we all know that that is very, very challenging to get that together, but that's the ideal world. If you can't get there, then at least if you had knowledge of what was going on around you, then that would at least facilitate a faster negotiation process. And you don't have that. There's a lot of commercial incompetence, you know, secrecy out there, and that just drives up cost. That's what happens.
What about, Chris, you mentioned when you spoke a minute ago about the state government's underwriting the risks. I mean, local councils are very also constrained about managing their risks. So could you say some more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the role that they, in my view, should play. They collect a lot more taxes. They've got scale benefits on a lot of their side, so they should do that. If they, again, joint procurement, they can't procure it. They're not on the ground for social licence, and that's a really important part here. Councils are on the ground. For want of a better word, they're responsible for the social licence because it gets processed for their constituents. And so they're dealing with that for the benefit of the state and everyone else. So the state should be, in my word, you know, in a way, paying them back for that by doing it. So I think the cost of social licence, you know, it's a hidden cost. No one actually knows how much it costs. But, you know, if you did put a price on it, it'd be pretty significant. So yeah, that's kind of a way you could economically rationalise it from the state government perspective.
Look, yeah, I completely agree with Phil. I think we've really got to be moving towards more of these alliance models. And you heard me say earlier, Remondis operates 78 public-private partnerships globally. We cover 33 million inhabitants, yet it seems to be, whether it's the regulations or risk appetite, but it seems to be something that we're not really adopting here in Australia and New South Wales. So I think whether it's the alliance model, that risk reward, and I guess that genuine transparency about what is happening in your business, whether that be change of law, whether that be capital, whether that be feedstock, whether that be something's happened that you both couldn't have foreseen, but it's a challenge that you have to meet together, and you both have that relationship. So generally, globally, Remondis would be taking like a 49% position or a 51% position in that. So quite often councils will still be the majority shareholder, but it really is that
genuine partnership. And you have to have that approach if you're talking about 20-year contracts with significant capital investment where, like I said, I'm still waiting for Amazon to deliver my crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen.
Okay, well, Chris probably doesn't realise that he's just become the most popular guy in the room because local councils have been saying this, that they can't go forward with everything else that the panel's saying without some sort of underwriting or support from the state government. So what we're going to do now is just open up to the floor. There'll be a couple of microphones roaming around for you to ask the panel your questions. And if you could wait, please, until a microphone comes to you. Raise your hand if you have a question, and when the mic gets to you, just let us know who you are and where you're from, but just wait for the microphone because we've got an online audience and they can't pick up what you're saying if you're not talking into a microphone. So, over here, Mike.
Hi there, it's Mike Wheeler from Inside Waste Magazine. I've got a question for Geoff about harmonisation across the states, which is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. If I was an investor, I know that Susie and Chris talked about feedstock, but also if I was an investor, I'd be worried about how long it takes to get approvals and when I get a return on investment on my plant and things like that. So just wondering about your thoughts on that.
I think harmonisation has a really important role to play. There are a number of different aspects that need to be considered as part of that. And again, I mentioned before about best practice. So there will be, I think, tweaks that happen from state to state because there are local differences. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of things. And you have the heads of EPA, they get together, they talk about various elements about where they can get that standardisation, how harmonisation occurring. And I think that would be great if they could expand on that further and really start to deliver on some of those areas. I know we've got a number of EPA reps here from different states, and I know that they talk all the time. So the more that we can see around that and see practical and effective ways that we can get that harmonisation, I think the better. Recognising that there may still be some tweaks in areas where, okay, it doesn't quite work, but that's okay. And you know, as long as we can try and develop on that and continue to work. Because again, we've spoken about the way the nature of the industry changes over time. You know, new information comes out. The classic one at the moment is PFAS and the way that's developing and the different standards that are in place around PFAS and some of the issues that are there. You know, PFAS is not nice stuff. And the question is, how do we manage it effectively? How do we get those standardised sorts of approaches occurring? And you look at PFAS in organics, there are different rules that are in place across different jurisdictions. And I think over time that will occur. So, but it's about the dialogue, it's about engaging and making sure that time is spent to try and work on it.
Anyone else on the panel want to respond to that, particularly in regard to predictable materials, once you have harmonisation? No. And we've got Ron Wainberg.
Hi, Ron Wainberg, MRA Consulting. I think what I've heard this morning has been spot on. And I think most people in the room...
That makes us feel very good because we're in awe of you, of course, Ron.
Oh, be quiet, Geoff. I've got the mic. I think we as an industry and the people at the coalface in waste management are probably slightly as guilty as the New South Wales government in the approach that we're both taking. And I use as an example of that the strategy that the government came up with. Very, very big on targets, none of which I think will be achieved, but that's a separate study. A lot of ideals of what we want to achieve, very short on an action plan on what actually to do. And I think what I'm hearing this morning is unfortunately very, very similar. We're all agreed on what the issues are, particularly I'm going to mention it a little bit more loudly, Susie, MWU and the sovereign risk that has been introduced into the waste investment as a result of that. I think what this room or this industry needs to do is come up with an action plan of how do we actually get government to listen and come to the table on this. Because unless these issues are solved, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. We're going to be talking in 20 years about the same things. I'd be interested to hear your views, or do you want to build me over there, Geoff?
Oh, never do that, mate. You're old, I'm not, so it's okay. But you know, Phil touched on it. back in 2016, at this event, he was talking about it. Susie's identified a number of key actions that could be taken. And I think we did mention before around having those KPIs, having impacts for not actually achieving some of those goals. And I think that's probably a really key target. Again, I mentioned about the bans in SA before. If you're not actually achieving those bans, there are impacts. So I think it's a carrot and a stick. Again, I always talk about the balance, as I mentioned before. It's the same here. You can't then expect a whole lot of money from the government for grants and all those sorts of things and then not deliver and have no impact. So for me, I think that there probably needs to be, again, that more balanced approach by how these sorts of targets are set and then actually delivered upon.
Geoff, I think you're absolutely right. It's one thing to have a mandate, but if there's absolutely no consequence for not meeting that mandate, what does that really mean? Like, we get to 2030, and look, I've spoken to a variety of councils, and I'm not going to name any of you, I promise. You've got people that are going to wait till 2030 for FOGO. Maybe this will change. Can I just go with FO? Are MUDs compulsory? It was quite interesting at the Aora session on Monday afternoon, and Amanda said, that's coming. You know what I mean? So I think, yeah, it's one thing to have a target, but if there's absolutely no consequence for meeting it, then what's that? So we need mandates and we need, like I said, consequences if you don't meet them.
Just adding to those targets, we've got the FOGO target there, but we've also got a commercial food waste mandated requirement by 2025. Does anybody know what that actually means? What's going to happen if you don't do it? Correct. So, we've got these high-level targets, but we've got no action plan as to how to actually get to that point. And as a result of that, there are some lead organisations who are already focused on that because of their own sustainability objectives, but there's a whole lot of just sitting back, waiting because they don't have to, and there's a lower-cost solution at this point in time. So, agree, action plans are what is required, and consequences when those actions are not achieved.
Yeah, I'd reiterate that as well. When you think about building the infrastructure, you've got the uncertainty on the investor side because you try and find the off-taker for that. But then on the off-taker side, they go, well, I've got no action plan. There is no action plan for the state, so things might change in the future. So am I really going to sign up for 10 years? What if somebody else builds the same infrastructure? Now I can get it cheaper. And what are my ratepayers going to say to me? So to your point, even an action plan is probably not enough. It probably needs to be an action plan with teeth, with a mandate and a consequence. I think the other panel members have said.
Can't help you.
Sorry, this one might be a little bit controversial, but what about APCO? They said actions, APCO, APC, NPC, same entity over 15 years, almost 20 years. They set targets, they've never delivered on anything. Now they have a number of members who are brilliant. They've done really, really good things. There's a lot of initiatives they've gone and done, brilliant. But again, APCO in its goals and whatnot, the targets haven't been met, but it doesn't really matter. They say, okay, well, fine, here's another idea that we'll go with. Again, some great initiatives, great ideas by APCO, and I'd love to see that they can actually deliver on it. I think that it was touched on earlier by Tony where he said that the regulatory space, they might get into this because it's not delivering, and maybe that's what needs to happen. So look, I think that, again, it just reinforces the things that we're saying here that need to actually have impacts for some of these things if they don't actually occur.
David McAllister, Resource Recovery Manager at Ipswich City Council, more importantly, ex-City Council, wrote, tendered, managed all the alliance contracts for Brisbane and the partnership contracts. Couldn't agree more with all the comments about delivering partnership models. But I had 650,000 tonnes of product that I managed and controlled. That makes a difference. That was just a general comment. Comment to Chris, I know you don't like to be nailed, but you raised the concern between government and council around targets. The one thing we haven't discussed is the generators. The public, the people generating the waste, the disconnect between all of these targets and all of this conversation and the people who just keep creating more product. And in Queensland, get a lovely rebate back to the governments to avoid any responsibility. Now that's changing, but nobody wants to have the conversation that says, it's your waste, it's your responsibility, what are we doing? How do we get the public to really get this?
Yeah, that's great. Great question. I mean, I've got young kids. I think they're getting it. So there's a generational change occurring. So, and I don't want to palm it off onto them because I think we've palmed off enough onto them with the climate altogether. Look, I think with data and technology, you'll be able to use it pays, get on top of this, and at some point, you can shift that. But yeah, for the time being, I think it's pretty hard. And look, honestly, when you want to solve a big problem like this and you want to do it quickly, behavioural change like that doesn't matter how you do it, isn't going to be fast enough for what we need to get done. So yeah, look, I hear you, but we need to get the other things kicked off first.
We just released the recycling behaviours report, for the third year running, and I think in relation to that, you can see that people want to do the right thing, but it's just really hard to understand what the right thing to do is. I remember just reading through the report and going, okay, do I take the metal lid off my glass bottle, or can I leave it on? Should I rinse my container, or is it okay if I don't rinse it? And I can ask probably, I don't know, half a dozen people across Cleanaway and get half a dozen different answers. So it is tough from that perspective. I think to Chris's point, technology will play a big part in terms of being able to certainly help with some of the separation of materials. But we do need to do more on education, do more on the actual initial packaging, and ensure that things are more recoverable and recyclable up front.
Look, Rich, I think you're absolutely right. And David, it's cultural. If you go to Germany, you just put something in the right bin and it's just an absolute part of your DNA. So I think as a society, as a culture, as a country, we have a way to go. And look, I think a lot of that is education. And look, Europe certainly has a benefit of, having been in that space for years, but it really is cultural. At Germany, nothing to have 7 bins in your kitchen, and that's just normal. You take all of those things to, whether it be community drop-offs or, like I said, they're paying a 40-cent CDS. So I think there's really a big education piece there. I think that will come through the generations. But to Richie's point, we can't afford to wait that long. We have to do something now.
Just picking up on, sorry, Geoff. Thanks. Picking up on Richie's point, standardisation, and that goes across, and I think that's a national topic. We, at a council level, council choose to decide what goes in a yellow bin, choose to up to a little while ago, choose what was going in a FOGO bin. But I think the standardisation nationally, but even if we know actually that we don't work nationally very well, we actually got 7 states and territories. We found that during COVID that everyone has their own control. But if we just pick at a state-based level, the EPA does a litter campaign, and it's a state-based campaign. We actually need state-based, in my opinion, state-based curbside recyclable campaign. We need a state-based FOGO campaign, that we're all doing the same thing. And the responsibility and the cost sits with state government, not with local government. So that all then is local government's responsibility is reinforcing that to their local constituency, but they're not the ones that have to fund it, develop it, drive it. And then you can, on every bus shelter that you see around Sydney, that drop it and you cop it, or whatever the latest slogan is for a litter campaign, you can have that for every other waste stream, every other principled waste stream that we're trying to divert from landfill.
Thanks. Just one
Sorry, Geoff.
quick extra thing to say. I agree 100% about the generator, and Phil touched before about the metrics that we use, and I don't have an answer to this, but the question for me is, how much are we actually diverting before it even gets into our system? There's a lot of effort. There's so much work that gets done by manufacturers, by commercial sites, by all sorts of different groups, whereby they will now divert material. They do a hell of a lot of work, and we never see it. So, I asked a question you would have seen in the report with Joe earlier on. There have been some numbers ticking up, flattened out a little bit in a number of areas. There's some key targets to work on, sure. But we as a nation, we're growing by population base. There's more manufacturing, there's greater GDP, it's always growing, etc. So that would suggest that we're actually doing a hell of a lot better than the numbers would suggest in a number of instances, because we're not actually seeing it in the first place in the industry. We're doing the reuse, we're doing the recycling, we're doing all these things before it even gets into our measuring metrics. And so can we capture that somehow? I've got no idea. Are there different metrics we could use to try and reflect some of that? Maybe there are. I don't know, but I think it's a really good point that you raise. And how do you actually try and then promote and support and congratulate those groups that are doing those really positive things?
I'm just going to take one more question from the floor. Helen's got her hand up over there, if somebody can get him. Oh, sorry, we've already got one.
Yep. Elizabeth Reid, Mandari Regional Council, Western Australia. Thank you very much for your comments. I think it's important that you have a free discussion of people innovative and what could be or couldn't be done, and just plant some seeds. While we'd all love in a real world to have it top down from state government, and yes, it does work with litter, it's going to take a long time. So I think from local government up would be a lot more practical, even though it's one of those things that's cost averse because we just keep on having all the jobs for state government. But I just want to float this. I appreciate and looked at your comments, listened to your comments about procurement. If local governments across Australia did at least a 20% procurement policy that they have to have across the board, whatever they buy, purchase, products, services, whatever, within their own turf, within their own state, do you think that that would be a catalyst to change? So that would change the way people do business, change what manufacturers can and can't do, change the tender process, and also wake state government up to realise if you don't look after your local government, you don't look after your people, you don't look after your state, we won't have anything at all. Thank you.
I think that's a really important part. Whatever the number is, 5, 10, 20%, whatever the number is, yes. And again, I'm seeing this with a number of the councils that I deal with. They're looking for that procurement, to have recycled products to be from local areas, whatever it might be. So I think, yes, that creation of demand, creating a pull-through effect, that's the critical part in doing this. And if you can create that demand, create the value for this product, these other guys, they'll invest, they'll put the money there because they know they're going to get a return out the back end. If you can guarantee that requirement for these materials to come through, they will do that investment. I mean, that obviously I'm just thinking the consulting space nowadays, but I had that background in the commercial sector, and that's what they're looking for.
And I took some notes this morning. It was really refreshing for Tony Chappell to bring up that exact same thing. So I think he had committed, I think it was later this year, they would go out for consultation around procurement. Council, government are a huge business in their own right. And if they can procure that recycled product back, whether that be glass in roads, whether that be pipe bedding, whether that be buying back compost, all of these things that council can do, if government can create that demand, again, appreciating it might cost more. I mean, to David's point, it's one thing to have a levy, but if you're not actually passing that on to your residents, what's that really look like? And anyway, different conversation. But yeah, I think really refreshing for Tony to actually acknowledge that the EPA and government has a huge part to play in creating that demand, especially for those recycled products.
I think also you probably want to harmonise that demand so that you actually can build this stuff at scale, because if you do it sort of at small scale, you just end up with higher costs. So if you just got one council that has to say 20% from my recovered materials, you're just going to have a very small, whatever type of facility it is. Again, your point is to sort of mandated targets, whether it be on the demand side or the supply side, and I think on the demand side that makes sense too.
I'm just going to take the last question from Helen. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you very much. My question also relates to market procurement and market pull. And I take note that last year at the SPE conference, Society of Plastics Engineers Conference for Plastics in Melbourne, there was a communique issued, and market pull and procurement was top of the list. They felt so strongly about it that systemic action was required. My question actually relates to getting into the detail of this, because I think that we are all pretty much in agreement, and so I'd like to ask the panel if indeed, for example, we should adopt a measure not dissimilar to Hamburg in Germany, where indeed they have to have LCAs considered as part of their procurement policies, or likewise in Netherlands as well now, or should we do such things as actually put in place a mechanism such as a rebate some kind of loan structure or something to underwrite the cost when indeed a procurement or tender comes through that has a greater cost. So there are different mechanisms we could pursue. I'm trying to actually get to the devil of the detail and how it might be done across the board in some systematic way.
I can make a quick comment back to the point I made earlier. You kind of have to define the problem you're trying to achieve and then find the most efficient way of delivering that, whether it be through a market-based mechanism or through grants back to the individual, but it's really, it's kind of down to that.
Shall I just jump in before you, Geoff? Thanks, mate. I think the practicalities and how that happens is a challenge, but I also think we need to think about what councils can procure, and is it actually materials that are in the waste streams that we're talking about. So we often, and some of that procurement, I'll call it, is it recycling or downcycling in a lot of cases? It doesn't quite go back to the circular. I'm not saying we shouldn't recycle or downcycle on our journey to circular, but it's not circular. And so I think in regards to procurement, what are you going to procure? Construction and demolition waste reuse in road construction? Absolutely. But some of the other waste streams that are coming out of the municipal solid waste or even the curbside recyclables, it's not something that council's going to procure. I think there's a bit of a broader debate around the scale of what that can do. Everything helps and everything will make a change. And a question in my mind is how much at a local government level can that actually deliver those outcomes? Question, I don't know the answer.
I think there's also another component around scale. So with this type of activity, and again, I'm a consultant here, so I should be saying, brilliant, do an LCA on every single job that gets done. But that's a lot of work, and a lot of consultants will be out there saying, brilliant, but I don't see the value in doing that every time. I think for me, it's more so some of the larger projects, sure, get that done. Or you could do some analysis to say, in principle, for XYZ type of projects, we've done the LCA, it should be applied. And this is where you might come up with your quota of it, 10, 20%, whatever the number is. And so you could do it, I think, on a indicative level across a range of different projects. And so that way you've got that guide to be able to give information to council, to councillors, to say this is a principle, this is why we're doing it. I find there's a lot of pushback in councils and within government around engineering performance, those sorts of elements. There's still a lot of questioning of the durability of recycled products to make sure that they do have the same performance, but there's also a lot of information to say, yes, it does perform well, it does just as well as virgin products, sometimes it does better. So getting back to the point, I think the LCAs are great, especially for some of the bigger projects. If you've got a multi-billion-dollar road project going down, yes, you should definitely be looking at how you get best value for that and get the best products in there and developing that full LCA to make sure that then as Phil was talking about, you're getting a real value for what you're doing with that work and the product and the project.
Right, thank you. Thank you to the panel. I'm sure everybody is going to go away from this session with something to think about. It's been really great information and great discussion. So just before you head off to lunch, could you please thank the panel for the presentation?